Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
36 hours? How far out are we?
36 hours,
Okay.
yeah. About 36
Okay.
hours, yes. Not that I'm counting.
Not that you're counting. Megan Scully heads up Bloomberg's coverage of Congress, and she says if the White House and lawmakers can't agree to a funding bill by midnight on Tuesday, the U.S. government will shut down. Ahead of a meeting at the White House on Monday, President Trump and congressional leaders from both parties are staking out their positions.
These people are crazy, the Democrats. So if it has to shut down, it'll have to shut down.
We don't want to shut down the government. It's Trump who's doing it, so ask him.
What you have is everybody trying to shift the blame, like who is going to be the one responsible politically for a shutdown, which seems increasingly likely as the hours go by.
Megan says the sticking points in negotiations come down to a couple key issues.
For Democrats, they have decided to centralize their message here on healthcare. Rising ACA premiums, that's the Obamacare premiums, that were kept at lower levels due to subsidies from the Biden administration. They're due to expire on January 1st. For Republicans, they are arguing that they want a so-called clean stopgap spending bill. They just want to keep the government funded until November 21st. And they said that they will negotiate on these ACA premiums and other demands from Democrats after they pass this bill.
Government shutdowns have become more and more common. But Megan says this one, if it comes to pass, would be very different. Aside from the usual fears of furloughs and delayed economic data, the White House has called for using a shutdown as a way to eliminate thousands of federal jobs, which could have a big impact on the economy.
In the last several years, we have seen markets largely shrug off the effects of a government shutdown. And what makes this one potentially more durable than previous shutdowns is the threat of mass firings.
Last week, the White House asked government agencies for plans to lay off rather than furlough many non-essential workers if the government shuts down.
If tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of U.S. government workers get laid off as a result of this shutdown, that means they do not get their back pay. They do not have jobs at the end of this. That will have a longer-term economic impact.
I'm David Gura, and this is The Big Take from Bloomberg News. Today on the show, as the U.S. gets closer and closer to another government shutdown, what's up for negotiation, what isn't, and why this shutdown could have a more significant impact on markets and the economy than we're accustomed to. It's Shutdown Eve, as Bloomberg's Megan Scully calls it. Democrats say they're not willing to budge on those Affordable Care Act subsidies. I asked Megan to explain why.
So they affect millions of Americans, and it would come with a bill of about $350 billion to increase these subsidies into the new year. That's a pretty hefty price tag, although it is something that Democrats say is necessary both, financially, but also economically. If a family's health insurance payments go up double, triple in the new year, that obviously has widespread economic effects. For Democrats, they see this as a winning argument heading into the 2026 midterms when they're hoping to reclaim control of the House, the Senate, or both. And wrapped up in this broader healthcare debate is, of course, the Medicaid cuts that were part of the huge Trump tax bill that passed on the backs of Republican-only support earlier this year. They're also demanding that these cuts get reversed. I think that is very unlikely to happen, but they are making it part of their broader messaging on this.
Given the fact that there are Republican voters who benefit from these subsidies, who rely on these subsidies, given the fact that this isn't just a blue state issue or a red state issue, are there Republicans who, down the line, conceivably would be willing to negotiate around this?
Yes, absolutely. And Republicans have said that they are willing to negotiate on this come, November, but let's just keep the government open. Within the Republican ranks, you certainly have some who would be opposed to this. Particularly, I'm thinking of fiscal conservatives like the House Freedom Caucus, who don't want to be spending this money. But what Democrats are saying is this is their biggest point of leverage. Republicans need 60 votes in the Senate to pass the stopgap spending bill. And for Democrats, they have the most sway now than they would have on a standalone healthcare only bill. So they see this as the best chance to get most of what they want.
Where is President Trump on these negotiations? Is he in line with Republicans in the House and Senate, or does he have kind of a different perspective here?
Last week he said, if there's a shutdown, there's a shutdown. It'll happen.
Well, this is all caused by the Democrats.
He was supposed to meet last week with the Democratic leaders of the House and Senate. That got canceled at the last minute. They are meeting today for the first time. The Republican congressional leaders will also be at this meeting. But we saw a little bit of a preview of that this morning with Carolyn Leavitt, the White House spokesperson, really digging into the president's message and Republicans' message writ large, which is it's our way or the highway.
There is zero good reason for Democrats to vote against this clean continuing resolution.
Either we pass the so-called clean CR or the government shuts down. Not expecting to see a whole lot of wiggle room coming out of this meeting today.
Megan says her expectations for how all of this will play out are based on years of reporting on past shutdowns and near shutdowns. They've become increasingly common over the last few decades.
There have been 14 shutdowns going back to 1981, which is when sort of the modern era of shutdowns began.
Before 1981, all government employees still had to report to work when there was a shutdown. So the disruption to government services was minimal. The biggest impact was on government workers who didn't get paid.
The last shutdown we had was the 2018 to 2019 shutdown, the 35-day shutdown during Trump's first administration and the longest shutdown in U.S. history. Since then, we have certainly gotten to the brink of a shutdown more times than I can count. Pretty much any time there has been a funding deadline, it is at the 11th hour that an agreement comes through. We saw that most recently in March, but we have not actually seen a shutdown now in nearly 7 years.
But this shutdown, if it happens, could look very different from any of those 14 previous shutdowns. That's coming up. Last week, the White House sent a memo to federal agencies ahead of this looming shutdown, saying it would, quote, use this opportunity to consider reduction in force, that it would lay off employees in government programs that don't align with President Trump's priorities. So I asked Bloomberg's Megan Scully what we know about the jobs that are potentially at risk if the government does shut down.
So we don't know certainly exactly whose jobs are at risk. They did say, programs that were not specifically authorized and jobs within the government that do not support Trump's broader agenda, both domestically and internationally. This is extremely, extremely unusual for a shutdown. Typically what happens is most federal employees get furloughed. Some deemed essential must report to work without pay. At the end of a shutdown, thanks to a 2019 law that was passed during the last long shutdown, federal employees must receive back pay. We have never seen an administration use a shutdown as an opportunity to carry out a mass firing of the federal workforce.
Should we see that as the White House acting opportunistically or some other way? In other words, the White House could kind of do these layoffs in the way they have during the first few months of the president's second term. Why is this the mechanism that they're thinking of using here?
Russ Vought, who is Trump's budget director, the chief of the Office of Management and Budget within the White House, and also sort of the architect of Project 2025, which has been sort of the guiding principle of many of Trump's policies in his first term, is a firm believer in a strong executive and sees this as an opportunity for Trump to really exert executive authority. Government funding runs out on October 1st. That then gives the president the ability to make these mass firings, that Congress did not do its job via the power of the purse, thus giving Trump the ability to do these. Of course, Trump's efforts to fire the federal workforce has been tied up in courts. We've seen him win a lot of these arguments, a lot of these cases in court, but this is sort of a new way for him to go about this.
Thinking more about Russ Vought's role here as the director of the Office of Management and Budget, there's this more muscular approach to executive power. Certainly these potential layoffs are a part of that. In the past, we've also relied on OMB for detail about what's supposed to happen if there is a shutdown. And I gather this time around, we're not getting a lot of clarity about the way that OMB is thinking about contingency planning.
Yes. So typically, by this point on shutdown eve, we would have agency by agency documentation of what will happen, who is considered an essential employee and who is not. Federal workers would start signing off on these shutdown plans, would be making their plans for when they leave work tomorrow if the shutdown does, in fact, go into effect. It certainly feels like this is very late to the game, especially because under law, federal employees who are non-essential need to start signing off on paperwork saying they will not be working during the shutdown.
Is there a risk that this government might not be ready to shut down by this deadline if they're not where they should be in terms of preparations for one?
They don't really have a choice, thanks to the Anti-Deficiency Act. When the shutdown comes, the government is shut down aside from essential personnel. We already know sort of the broad contours of who are the essential workers. Active duty military is considered essential workers. Emergency workers like FEMA, as well as air traffic controllers, all considered emergency employees. So, that's pretty much set. There is some concern, though, that this will certainly be more disruptive and more chaotic because of the absence of planning and communication to the federal workforce. So this has rippling effects across the country. People not knowing whether they need to report to work or not on Wednesday certainly is disruptive and just kind of adds to the chaos of an already turbulent event.
In March, the country faced another funding deadline. Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer warned that a shutdown would allow the administration to, quote, destroy vital government services at a significantly faster rate than they can right now. He ultimately decided to vote to fund the government to avoid that scenario. And he faced a lot of blowback for that decision from progressives within the Democratic Party. This time, Megan says, he's taking a very different approach.
Going back to March, the last time we were at this funding stalemate, Schumer at the last minute decided that Trump, who was only 2 months into his second term at that point, was too powerful to risk it politically for the party. And so a minority of Democrats in the U.S. Senate voted with Schumer to avert a shutdown. That immediately prompted blowback from progressives within the party who saw this as Senate Democrats really just acceding to Trump and to Republicans. Schumer personally had his own book coming out that same week, and he had to cancel his book tour due to the tremendous backlash he was receiving. So I think it's fair to say he learned his lesson that time around. Should also note that Trump's approval ratings have been sort of on a decline in the intervening 6 months, giving Schumer more ability to really risk it here. And we are also inching closer to the 2026 midterms. Democrats are seeing this more as an opportunity to stand up to the Trump administration. And politically for them, that is more of a net positive than it was 6 months ago.
I'm very curious sort of what you see as potential off-ramps here. So there is this meeting on Monday at the White House among congressional leadership and the president with just hours to go here till funding runs out. How do you see this playing out, or what are the ways in which it could play out in the next few hours?
I think that the most likely scenario here is that the government shuts down at 12:01 a.m. on October 1st. There is, I would say, a potential for them to come out of this meeting and agree to a very short stopgap spending bill, something in the order of a week or two, and say, we will vote in the Senate today to keep the government open until October 7th or October 10th to avert a shutdown this week. But Democrats saying we are not going to agree to this longer 7-week stopgap that Republicans have demanded. If that were to happen, the Senate could vote on that tonight. And the House, which it's important to note, are out of town until October 7th, they could then vote by unanimous consent, sort of in absentia, to keep the government open. And as provided nobody objects to that, then that could certainly be the Band-Aid for the next week or so. Especially as storms threaten the southeast coast right now, that is certainly a possibility that we should not discount. But partisan tensions being what they are at this moment, I am not banking on that.
Megan, how do you think about the potential consequences of all of this to markets and the economy, and looking at those past shutdowns we've talked about? What impact have they had, and when does it really become an issue for investors and for the U.S. economy broadly?
So A shutdown is not the market-rattling catastrophe that, say, a debt ceiling breach would bring about. But it certainly is disruptive, at least in the short term. In the last several years, we have seen markets largely shrug off the effects of a government shutdown, and we have seen that in the run-up to this one. What we could see sort of in the immediate aftermath of a shutdown is some short-term market consequences and certainly some short-term economic consequences.
For example, if there is a government shutdown, the jobs report won't come out on Friday when it's scheduled to.
That certainly is a huge indicator of where the economy is and where it's going. And not having that then has effects on what decisions people make in the short term on their finances and on their investments. Typically, though, in a government shutdown, any economic effect or market effect is short-lived, even during the 35-day shutdown of 2018 and 2019.
Again, that's for the typical government shutdown. But like we've been saying, this time could be different if the White House follows through on its plan to use the government shutdown as a way to further reduce the federal workforce. If those workers lose their jobs, instead of merely being furloughed with back pay, the economic consequences of this government shutdown could have a much bigger impact. This is The Big Take from Bloomberg News. I'm David Gura. To get more from The Big Take and unlimited access to all of Bloomberg.com, subscribe today at Bloomberg.com/podcast offer. Thanks for listening. We'll be back tomorrow.